Thank you all very much. So it's lovely to be well received when it's raining.
Welcome to the International Book Festival. My name is Rosemary Barnett, and it's my delight to be chairing this event with Ben Okri. I think it's the fourth or fifth time I've chaired you, Ben. So
I thought it was the seventh.
Maybe. I don't think that Ben needs much of an introduction from me. We're here to discuss his latest book, which is called The Freedom Artist, in which he combines elements of magical realism, storytelling, fable, political thought, and satire to give us a wake-up call for our modern age. I hope you agree with that.
Yeah, everything except the magical realism bit.
There's a bit of that in it.
I don't call it magical realism, I call it poetic realism.
Okay. Let's play with words.
We'll have a good argument after.
You start by using a word that I had to look up, which is anomie. Do you want to tell us a little bit about anomie?
Well, no, there's not much to say. Anomie is where we are right now. Anomie is where we are. If you feel it, you know what I'm talking about. We're in a curious place of disconnect between our will, our deepest desires and dreams, and the reality of our political and social situation in the world right now. The Freedom Artist is about the idea that the world is a prison, and that we inhabit many prisons inside us. Prisons of culture, prisons of class, prisons of ideas, prisons of gender, prisons of literature, prisons of art. We sort of like, we human beings, we're like crawling with prisons. Most of them we make ourselves in the habit of thought, the neurosis of habitual thought. But just on a social level, it's worth sharing with you that Boris Johnson has just put forward the idea of extending the prison population by 100,000. The subtitle of the book is Who is the Prisoner? It's kind of like the question I'd like to put in capital letters right now. The thought about prison services, and this novel is not about prison services, I just like the incidental connection. The thought about the prison services for some time now is that actually sticking people in prison doesn't actually really solve the problem. And apart from that, the prison population is like bursting. We don't have enough prisons for the people we're sticking in prison. So the idea of creating 100,000 more places for prisoners is already the idea that there are over 100,000 people who ought to be in those prison places. So it is already a pre-criminalization of society, if you know what I mean.
But isn't it about creating a culture of fear?
And it's also about creating a culture of fear. But you create a culture of fear by, as it were, altering the myths and the ideas and the perceptions that the people have about their society. You have to alter those perceptions first before the culture of fear can be created. And I'm fascinated by this culture of altering the perception and the myths of the people that's been happening over the last 5-7 years. And it's one of the things that the book primarily addresses, that we are being profoundly and subtly mentally manipulated into sleepwalk, into an acquiescence with unacceptable conditions which one day we will wake up to and we will say, how did we get to this horrible place that we didn't know we were getting to? And that's how it happens. They manipulate us, we sleepwalk, we wake up one day, and we're in this unbelievable place. And we say, how did we get here? And they will say to you, well, you kind of voted for it. And I think the important job of storytellers, one important job of storytellers, is to unmesmerize us. I think we're too mesmerized by authority figures. They give us false facts and we believe it. And even when we don't believe it, we don't question it enough to undermine it. Sorry, I got carried away.
That's okay. I suppose one of the ways they want you to get carried away. One of the ways in which, in the book, people are fooled, if you like, is that gradually people stop reading. Even the machines invented to make reading easier and portable fell into disuse. People simply stopped reading the ancient classics. They couldn't read anything that required a little thought. Literacy vanished from the world along with bookshops. I mean, that's where we are.
That's already happening.
Yeah.
That's already happening. One of the astonishing facts I discovered some time ago was that the British Council was closing all of its libraries around the world. Now, you would think British Council libraries around the world, is this really of any great significance? Well, I happen to think that it is. Because in many parts of the world, some parts of the world where the libraries were active, it sort of did what libraries actually are supposed to do, which is to be a repository for thoughts and questions. So they're closing all the libraries around the world. And then in the high streets in London, and my part of London, the libraries are closing down throughout the country. And where the libraries are not closing down, they've stopped sort of stocking books. They now have like DVDs and CDs and other alternative forms of the word, as it were. But the book is itself slowly becoming under a question mark. Now, some people will say, well, is the book really so important as all that? But I would say, yes, the book is, because the book is a symbol of thought. It's a symbol of questions. It's a symbol of inquiry. Where else can we go to find out what people have been thinking about any area of discourse for the last 2,000 years? Where can we go if not to books? I mean, there was a time when the elders of a society held all the thought, held the whole lineage, all the traditions of a people. But as our thought, as our accomplishments, and our society got wider and wider, that became impossible. It really became a case of asking too much for 2 or 3 people to hold all the knowledge that a society can hold. So that traditional way had to give way to the book, which is the great archive of humanity. And to shut down the book in one form or another is actually to begin to diminish not only our freedoms, but our capacity for imagining our freedom. Because the book for me is not just about reading what's there. It's actually about a collision between what's on a page and what's in our mind. So it's not the book per se, it's the active dialogue that the book sets up in us. It's the questions, it's the power of the mind that the book reinforces. Now, I happen to think that all hierarchies really need for us to be less powerful in our minds. It is absolutely crucial that we become mentally weaker so that they can do the stuff that they want to do. And I think we should become mentally stronger. I think we should become mentally more ferocious. I think we should become fiercer-minded. I think we should become absolutely bloody-minded and less accepting of the certainties, the facts, the opinions, the details that they give to us about who we are and about how this world can be. And it's one of the things that literature does transcendentally well.
In the book,
books can't defend themselves.
No.
We have to do it.
Yeah. But in the book, you know, we're in a world of fake news and controlled by the hierarchy. What does it take? People are sleepwalking, which again is an analogy with what's happening with us. What does it take to make Karnak wake up?
Well, it takes the loss of a loved one.
Mm-hmm.
It's very strange. but it seems to be quite possible that we human beings can endure any number of slow and imperceptible erosion of our freedoms, of our thought, of our truths. But it gets to a point where something becomes unacceptable to our spirit. And I think that something is different for different people. For some people, it's the loss of their child. For some, it's the death of their parents. For some, it's a casual insult. For some, it's rejection. It is astonishing how much we human beings actually can take before we say no. And for Karnak, it just took the love of his life disappearing one morning because she dared to ask the question, who is the prisoner? In the intimacy of their home.
And somehow Big Brother heard that.
And Big Brother is more than a reality.
Yeah.
I think Orwell has been truly assimilated by the power structures.
In parallel to the story of Carmack and Amalantis, there's the story of Meera Baba, who is a poetical, I suppose that's where mostly the poetical reality resides in the book. So tell us a little bit about Meera Baba and what he means to you.
Well, first of all, let's look at the name. I'm fascinated by the magic of names. I think any good writer pays a great deal of attention to the names of their characters. Now you have to do it in such a way that the name doesn't appear as if it overly prefigures what they are. A lot of us novelists, we tend to have characters called Hater, who is a really hating figure. That's kind of obvious. So someone called Nasty, I.E. at the end, who very nasty. But you take a name like Meera Baba. What does Meera Baba make you think of? What does Meera make you think of?
To look.
To look also comes from the root of miracle. And Baba? Baba?
Father, they're saying.
What else?
Baby.
Huh? What else?
Ali Baba.
Ali Baba. Ali Baba. Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a combination of those two things. I've always felt that we can't tell the story of the liberation of our spirits without dealing with all the three levels that make us as human beings: the body, the spirit, and the mind. And for me, Meera Baba represents the dimension of the spirit, the dimension of the soul. All the great satires and novels about unacceptable future tend to focus on our material condition. But I happen to think that our spiritual condition is an important part of how we become liberated. And I think that our liberation is incomplete unless there is a spiritual dimension to it of one kind or another. Because I think unavoidably we are flesh and we are spirit. And how do you define spirit? Spirit is that part of us that animates our being. It's the deepest, the core of what we are. It's the part of us that even suffering cannot reach. It's the part of us that love animates. It's the part of us that makes us endure through time. It's the part of us that is that finally cannot be destroyed, but can be made to fall asleep. So for me, it's the spirit, not the body. It's the spirit that needs to be woken up.
Yeah.
So the question, who is the prisoner, is a direct question to asking, well, who in you, what part of you is really imprisoned? And what part of you really needs to be free for every other freedom to follow?
Yeah, and how are you to wake that part of you
And
up?
how do you wake that part of you?
Yeah. Are you ready to read a little bit now?
I'm never ready to read, but
Okay. Well, let's go.
why don't we go while I find somewhere unsuitable to read? You're not waiting for me, are you?
Well, I was, but do you want me to?
Yes.
Okay, so
Keep going.
there's a phrase that you use, or a sentence that you use, that I've been thinking about and wanted to talk to you about. Everything we need to know is concealed in what we most take for granted.
What bothered you about that sentence?
I just don't really understand it.
What do you mean?
I would like you to explain it to me.
Can you read it again, slowly?
Everything we need to know is concealed in what we most take for granted.
What do you guys think of that sentence? Everything we need to know is concealed in what we most take for granted. I mean, it's hardly a sentence from Finnegan's Wake. I mean, every single word in that sentence is clear, right? What do we most take for granted? Give me some things we most take for granted. What's that about law? Rule of law, freedom. What else? What?
Breath.
Breath. Thank you. What else? What? Ontology? Utility. Oh, I thought that was a profound philosophical remark. It still is, but. Anybody else? What do we most take for granted? The weather. I never take the weather for granted. Who? Parents. Anything else? Gravity. What was that about authors?
Wish to sell books.
I never take that for granted. Limitations. Does that help?
Yep.
I would like to add to that list the air we breathe, the mystery of our dreams at night, the conversations with interesting elders, strangers, and friends, fairy tales,
Myths. Mm-hmm.
Ancient traditions that we are slowly forgetting, and so on and so forth. It's my way of saying, or it's the character's way of saying that maybe there are three kinds of wisdoms in the world. One kind is in books, and another kind is in us. And then a third kind, maybe the most mysterious kind, is in the condition of being human.
Okay, thank you for that.
That took 10 minutes.
I don't think it took 10 minutes. No.
I better read something
Yeah.
before you ask me another awkward question.
That's my role.
Well, I'm just going to read this. It's one of my favorite early passages in the book. And in some ways, the key. There were, in those times, two classes of people. One, the overwhelming majority, were the normal people. They did not speak much. They did their work, fulfilled their obligations, raised their families, read the newspapers, absorbed all they read, watched television, and believed all they saw. They kept their nightmares to themselves. They constituted the highest presence in hospital wards and psychiatric clinics. They had as a running music in their heads, a steady, unchanging drone. And yet, at night, in room after room, across council estates or in rich suburbs, screams could be heard coming from their beds. They shouted in their sleep and howled like frightened animals. This could be heard at night all across the land. It became so common that soon it was considered the normal mode of sleep. That is to say, no one noticed it anymore. The second kind of people looked like the first, except for one thing: they were more alert. They didn't sleep much at night. Their eyes had a constant wakefulness. They didn't read the newspapers, treated television as a daily farce, and believed nothing of what they saw or heard. They worked as little as possible and yet were immensely productive. They seemed solitary, but were not lonely. They ventured no philosophy and offered no resistance. They seemed absent when present, but they were present when absent. They did not scream in their sleep and never had nightmares.
And then the hierarchy started arresting people who weren't screaming in their sleep. Or
Yes.
trying to. Children.
Yes,
Yeah. And then they found out that so many of them were innocent.
yes.
So they had to discover new ways of
Discovering people who were not
yeah,
screaming in their sleep.
yeah.
I was walking one day in London late at night, coming home from something or other, when from a room I heard a very, very strange howl, a howl that was like a death howl. And then suddenly it was silent. I went on walking, and then in another street, getting close to home, I had a different kind of howl. And I already had the idea for this book, and those two separate howls became part of the structure of this book. Just a sense that maybe the things that we repress in our day, we express in our night.
There's a very interesting, well, loads of interesting thoughts in your book, but at one point Amalantis says, "In our world, teaching does all the damage. I would like to unteach. That is when you undo the damage that the system has done." This notion of unteaching, I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, we should have a university of unteaching. Get a PhD there. You come out as innocent as when you were, as rebellious and as innocent as when you were 14, and much more intelligent. What does everyone think about the idea of unteaching? I've spent the last 10, 20 years unlearning a lot of stuff. You know? They always give us the impression that education is about putting in. But I think education is also about taking out, uprooting.
Actually, that's what the word education means, to lead out.
Yes. But I also mean like taking out.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that really good gardeners spend most of their time weeding.
That's true.
We should do that from time to time, don't you think? Where do you think we should go for sort of a bit of mental weeding?
Edinburgh Book Festival?
Yeah, she's good.
There is a scene in the book which is where somebody asks Karnak to help him take an old lady who's in a wheelchair out of a van and take her to hospital. And it's a really surrealist scene where they take her to this ward, and you can explain better than I can what happens in the ward.
Oh no, I think it's best if you read it. It really, really is.
I read it.
Yes, you read. Do you know the page? While you're finding the page, I'm going to read the very, very first page of this book. In my career as a writer, I have managed to devise a couple of very, very short sentences and short chapters In the Age of Magic, I think I had one of the shortest chapters I've ever managed. And here, in The Freedom Artist, I think I did one word better. And the very first page of the book begins with 2 words: read slowly. Which I really hope when you get the book that you don't skip that page. Because it would be a real shame. And I think you should spend most of the time of the reading of the book on the reading of that page. Yes.
Are you not going to read the page that we should read slowly?
I just have.
Or you just Okay, so this is a scene where this lady has been taken into this hospital ward and she's near death. Karnak saw a strange, wild celebration in the hospital ward, a bacchanalia all around him. Patients just back from operations or waiting to be operated on exploded in raucous merriment. With tubes coming out of their noses and chests, they were spouting rough, vulgar jokes, coughing and laughing and clowning around. Some of them were demonstrating funny walks. Some of them were showing off their private parts, bending over, exposing their rear ends. Many were talking feverishly in tongues. Most of them were already drunk. They'd thrown their mattresses on the floor and were banging on the metal beds with their false legs, telling loud stories about outrageous sexual encounters from their youths. They were all talking at once, raising their voices, shouting at each other, laughing at nothing. Karnak was shocked by the mood in the ward. They were the dying, the terminally sick, advanced cancer patients, and they were happy. He'd never seen such merriment, never heard such laughter, such free expression of feelings and language.
Why are you looking at me? Yeah, it's an inverted world where those who are about to die are happier than those who are living.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that also the important thing about that scene also has to do with the woman who was brought in, where she says at some point that the system had lied to her and that the system had defrauded her of her life and that the system had made her spend all her days in fear and that she had not, in effect, lived her life. And I really wanted that scene and that passage to be very, very poignant and a little bit shocking because it's something that I've felt very strongly over the last 10, 15 years. The question of, do we really live our lives?
And roses. I brought some roses for you.
Oh, thank you. Why?
Because roses are a very important part of the book.
Who else loves roses? Yay! I got my family in the audience.
They smell nice too.
Thank you.
So what is it about the rose that you find so important that it becomes a symbol for the book?
I think the rose has kind of drawn itself as a symbol for centuries. I think it's first of all the layered nature of the rose. When you look at the petals of a really, really red rose, it sort of gives this idea that it has kind of like worlds inside it. It really manages to create an extraordinary visual illusion. Also the rose, I think, is one of the most beautiful flowers of unfolding. It really is. To watch a rose unfold from a bud, this tiny little bud, and it just sort of releases all of these petals. It sort of opens and so on. People have always taken that as a great symbol of the evolution of the spirit and of the soul. I think also because a rose is an image of beauty, one of the highest images of visual beauty that we can think of. And also, I think many underground organizations have always used the rose as a symbol of liberation.
Great. And the power of the rose, we've talked about the power of the smile. You say the difference between the two kinds of people was this: those who did not smile read the revised myths seriously, solemnly, importantly.
You need to read that sentence again.
He's a great person to chair, you know. He makes you feel really comfortable.
Well, you're doing the same thing to me.
Okay, touche. The difference between the two kind of people was this: those who did not smile read the revised myth seriously, solemnly, importantly. Those who smiled read them with hidden laughter. So tell us about those two different kinds of people. Are there two different kinds of people in this tent?
What do you think? Yeah. I think it's really all about it's all about interpretation. Take the word myth, drop it, and put in its place policies, political statements, tweets. Put anything you want in its place, and there are two kinds of people who respond to these things in two kinds of ways. One set take them very seriously and believe them. Another group of people read them ironically, read them already with an undermining smile. And I'm trying to encourage more of the second kind of people.
Yeah.
I think the more seriously we take things, the more power we give them. And I think an irony of interpretation, an irony of reception, which already involves a certain amount of skepticism, I think is very, very healthy. Even what it is that you love most, a tinge of irony is healthy, because it keeps us from being over-mesmerized, even by ourselves. Yeah.
We talked earlier about what it took to wake Karnak up. And I do feel that we, generally speaking, are sleepwalking into...
We're doing that right now, absolutely.
And I suppose my question is, we're not Karnak. What would it take to wake us up? Just an easy question.
No, that's not an easy question. Because I'm looking back at history. I'm looking back at history, history of the 20th century. And I'm thinking, well, what did it take to wake up the German people? I'm looking back at the history of slavery. I'm thinking, what did it take to wake up the African people? You look at history and you have to come to a slightly unhappy conclusion. It takes a lot to wake us up. And I think it's because the people who work power understand that they work power upon us as a mass, but we receive power as individuals. So individually, we're maybe overwhelmed. Individually, we feel powerless. Individually, we feel we can't do anything. Individually, we feel that the problem is too big for us. And that is one of the secrets of how power works. We individually are full of doubt. We have already undermined ourselves. We've already taken away from ourselves the most important thing that we have, which is the power to say no. So it's that individual weakening that is the problem. What does it take to wake us up? I think the best thing would be for a mass waking up. If all of us can be woken up by something reaching an unacceptable level of insult, of outrage. But I'm afraid the individual thing plays in there. I mean, right now we're drifting to a place where just slightly under half of the population just didn't vote for. And we just literally, one day after another, we're going to this place that will change the history of these islands completely for the next 20, 50 years. We're not running ahead to think of how awful or how frightening this might be. And each day we just go to sleep and wake up, and one day passes, and another day passes, and that's how it happens. What will it take to wake us up? A visualization, a clear vision of the unacceptable. But who is going to give us that vision?
You are.
Well, we just need a lot of voices. We need a lot of awakeners. We need a lot of... I don't think we can depend on the political structure anymore to help wake us up. I think we need other routes. I think we need a big coming together. I think we need a different kind of legal disruption. I think we need a new kind of I'm going to make up a word here, vocality. I think we've gone beyond banners. I think we've gone beyond banners. I think marches are not doing it. We shouldn't stop them, but we need to be more creative. I don't know, what will it take to wake us up? I think going over the precipice. I hope we don't wake up as we're falling.
Me too.
What do you think?
I think we've got time for questions now, so maybe we could have the lights down, and if you could wait for the microphone to come to you, that would be good.
A lady there just said the challenges of being awake is staying awake. Good. Yes, together. Good point.
Okay.
It's your turn.
There's a question.
People, it's your turn. Let's hear your questions, your thoughts, your shouts.
You talked earlier about people not reading and libraries closing. Is it the fault of the internet and the kids at school, rather than looking up something, asking Alexa what the answer is?
I don't think the two are mutually exclusive at all. I really don't see why a new technology should entirely drive out the old. I think they're different. I think they're different skills. I think they're different resources. And I've found that people who've loved a book that they've bought on the internet and read on Kindle, that they want to own those books in the flesh. It tells you something about the materiality of the book. That just having a book as an idea, which is what the Kindle thing is not enough. We want to have it as a flesh. We want to have it as a thing. Don't ask me why, but we from the whole history of humanity has been a history of our desire to concretize that which we cannot imagine, to concretize that which we intuit. We give forms to our gods. We give forms to thunder, to various forms of the powers of nature. And to want to give forms to a book, which is a collection of ideas and dreams, is just as natural. We're form givers as well. We're embodiers. When we've made something in some form, we feel like it is now us and we are it. So I'm not afraid of Alexa. I'm not afraid of the internet. I just think that we should not lose the value of the book and what the book represents as a reality and as an idea and as a symbol.
Somebody over there?
Thank you.
You have, thank you, to a certain extent, awakened me with your first images. I shall judge myself about whether I do anything about it, because I think there's, for me personally, a distinction between feeling awakened but then actually action, which I'm not very good at. I rely on the book, the written word, my thoughts. Going back to your first, what you said was a digression, but I think was really the metaphor, partly for your book, perhaps, I haven't read it yet, is the imprisonment. And I need, as someone who knows a bit about that, to object to this proposal of pre-penalizing people, as you call it. It struck me when I was working with prisons that the United States locks up per capita 6 times as many people as what was the highest locker-upper in Europe then. Since then, we have the distinction of being top of that list, I think, in Europe. We're still in Europe. 6 times as many. I mean, so any idea that locking up prison is anything other than a social and political decision is out.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a startling thing, and if we follow the US so often in some of our social policies, this is one instance where I think you've awakened me, perhaps, and I'll judge myself whether I go out and, what do? Write a letter? That's the sort of thing that but to try and actually say something about what I know very well. Anyway, so thank you very much for a very stimulating session.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I just want to add to that very quickly that a society is the key image of what it does. So when you have a society like the United States actually has more black men in prison, the proportion of black men in prison to the proportion of black men out of prison is unbelievable. And just that fact alone already tells you something about what's going on in society. Not just only in terms of race, but just in terms of the idea of imprisonment itself. The idea of the prisoner lurks profoundly behind the idea of society. So thank you. Please, there's a lady at the front.
I know, but...
And a lady at the
Yeah.
back. So let's and a gentleman.
Who's gone first?
No, you've got the mic. See, use it.
You were careful to make the distinction earlier between poetic realism and magic realism. I'd just like to ask you to explain that, please.
Well, magical realism is a very defined school that constitutes a certain number of books, some of which are wonderful and very famous, and some of which are turgid and not very famous. And I have been put in that school without proper evidence, and I have protested with decreasing insistence over the years. I'm now sort of slightly resigned to it. But in this particular instance, with this book, it is poetic realism because like I said, the book operates on three levels. There's the overarching narrative of Karnak, who is this young man who believes everything about the tenets of his society, which is an imprisoning society. Then there's his girlfriend, who asked the question, who is the prisoner, and who has got taken away to that infinite darkness. And then there's Meera Baba, who represents the spirit and the soul. So there are 3 different levels, which for me speaks to 3 different levels in us. And for me, that's poetry. When you use one thing to speak of another, that's one of the core aspects of poetry. Also, poetry for me is metaphor as truth. Not metaphor as metaphor anymore. The metaphor is the truth. That's how I worked in this book, very rigorously. Also, the thing about poetic realism is that it asks you to dream a little. Not too much, but a little. And that little dreaming does all the work. Whereas magical realism asks you to dream a hell of a lot. There's a difference in scale.
Okay, first this lady and then that lady.
Somewhere else you said about choices we make.
Where are you speaking from?
Here.
There.
Ah,
Choices we make, and about beware of stories we're told, or stories we make up and tell ourselves. And there's something about in chapter 30, and you talk about this infinite, you've just talked about the infinite web of darkness. You're talking about the infinite web of light. When different destinies all come together, and there's some sort of vision beyond our particular storytelling. And so often, because it's written in the book, we say it's true. So it's how we bring our own story out from our head, heart and guts that are not just culturally conforming or just speaking out for the sake of speaking out, and to actually get to some sort of vision that can be more universal, this infinite light. Would you like to say more about what you said in chapter 30? Because I think that's intriguing as to how we might move forward in a more universal way.
You're very kind, but you assume that she's got chapter 30. I was about to make a very fine speech there. That's not the chapter 30 she means.
Oh.
You're talking about that chapter where I talk about an infinite web of destinies.
Okay.
There are kind of two threads, of metaphors. There's one about this infinite web of darkness and this infinite web of prisons, and there's this infinite web of destinies. And I think the two things are related for me, at any rate, when I was writing the book. I want to say very quickly that often when you write a novel, you write things that you didn't know that you know. Writing is a very, very strange process. And I generally recommend that people write for themselves to discover the things that they didn't know that they felt or knew that will only come out in the writing. And I intuited in the writing of this book that we're not as individually separate as our eyeballs make us think that we are. If we look at the world through our eyes, I'm here and you're there, and nothing connects us. But if you look at the world from another way, another height, there's a web of light that connects us, a web of destiny that connects us. And I think the internet is just a very, very paltry materialization of this transcendent idea. And I think this idea is very important to have in this hugely atheistic time in which we're living. Because one aspect of atheism strengthens the idea that we're separate from one another. It doesn't mean to do that, but that's one of the things it does. Because it makes us focus on the fact that actually we're all completely individual beings, and if we look at ourselves from, as I said, the eyeballs, nothing connects us. And yet, we intuit a connection. It's the reason why we form societies, it's the reason why we march, it's the reason why we protest, it's the reason why we come together like this, it's the reason why people feel the need to come together to make laws, to change laws, it's because we feel that we're connected. And we need a reinforcement of that sense of connection. I think it gives us power. I think it gives us power to protest. It gives us power to overcome this terrible sense of isolation that we all feel, this terrible sense of loneliness, this awful powerlessness that cripples us, that makes us accept the terrible things that we read in the headlines every day. So it's not just a personal empowerment that's important here, it's an empowerment of our connectedness that I wanted to speak about.
This lady here.
Thank you. Such a difficult question.
I'm
Yes.
going to stand up.
Yes.
Mr. Okri,
Thank you.
you started first with the word they, and then there was an articulation of two kinds of people in sort of binary way, but I understand I'm not treating that simplistically. And immediately that woke me up and made me start to think. And I thought, with the greatest humility, might there be a third kind of person, in the sense that I feel sometimes there's a risk that when things are articulated in this way, that you get, I for one get another kind of they. So there's a they on that side and another they on this side. And in some senses, that makes me feel suspicious of both sides. I think having prisons part of the human condition, and the best of us try to open doors to let people in or free ourselves. But it's just this thing about immediately I begin to feel a bit nervous and a bit afraid. I think, oh, there's a they identified on that side, or maybe this is another kind of they, that I need to be aware of. I don't mean, I'm asking this with the greatest humility and for your response.
James Baldwin said in a magnificent essay, I know what power is. It has been worked on me. He didn't say they. He said, I know what power is. It has been worked on me. The implied they there is huge. It's huger for not being said. The they there is contained in the word power. I think when you have a poetics that says a they on the one hand and a they on the other hand, it really is a way of starting a kind of dialogue. It's a way of brushing against one another what appears to be two opposing ways of looking at the world. There could be 3, there could be 4, there could be 5, but even when there are 70 or 7,000, at the heart of the dialogue, there's always 2 brushing against one another. It's always the case. 5 can be brushing at the same time, but the smallest unit of the brush is 2. Yeah? That's where the dialogue starts. That's where the opposition starts. So it's not a binary way of looking at the world. It's looking at the smallest unit of where a dialogue starts, where a dialogue starts inside us. If there is nothing to oppose, there is almost no sense of self. So your rejection of or your question of the idea of they is already a wish to reduce all the existing boundaries in the world. And the boundaries are there. They've been erected by people, by laws in some cases. In the case of South Africa, those laws were very, very rigid, and the problem of the they was much more powerful and unavoidable. Poverty of any kind, whether you live in Grenfell Tower, whether you live in Ajegule, whether you live in how Brixton used to be, when you live there, you really know that you are the me that James Baldwin was talking about. The idea of prisons is actually not as old as the human condition. They didn't have prisons. Cavemen and women didn't have prisons. It was invented really more or less in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century. It's a relatively recent invention. Unfortunately, I think it was I think the Brits were one of the great early inventors of prisons, unfortunately. So the idea of prison, a physical prison, is recent, but the idea of being imprisoned is not. It goes back to Socrates, it goes back to myths. Prometheus was nailed to the mountains of the Caucasus, chained to it. That was a form of imprisonment. That was a form of separating a god from other gods, a powerful person from other people. So I like your skepticism, but you don't want it to get to a point where it prevents you from being an active citizen. Sometimes we have to identify the people who are affecting our reality. We have to do that. If you're living during the Third Reich and you say, well, who are the they and who are the us, and you're a Jew, you have a problem. You know, you have to know who is affecting your reality. You have to know it if you're going to fight it. So I take your philosophical problem, but on a political dimension, on a dimension of human freedom, it's a little bit more complex. I hope that's answered your
If you could be
interesting-
very quick with your question.
Okay, I'll be quick. I wonder if...
Where are you speaking from?
I'm here.
Where?
Here.
Stand up.
There.
There you are. Thank you.
I wonder if to educate, to liberate, you have to go beyond the fact-based information that we hope becomes knowledge to somehow get that knowledge to be wisdom that's deeply embedded in a person. And wisdom, unlike facts and knowledge, you want to do something with. You want to make it real. How we get to that stage and how schools or universities get to that stage has to challenge powerful systems, it seems to me. How we do that might begin with education as a liberatory force rather than a functional force.
I totally agree. Absolutely. The only problem is that education is always a political issue.
Yeah.
So, you know, education tends to be shaped by the party that comes in power often. So I totally agree with what you're saying, but I think there should be another level of education, one that we, I don't know who this we are, whether it's parents, whether it's people who are concerned about the really deeper issues of society, whether it's myth makers, storytellers, poets, activists, anybody who feels themselves deeply concerned about it, whether there should be another kind of education that we create and help to disseminate, which, for want of a better word, I would say is the oldest education that we've inherited from our wise ancestors, which needs to be constantly refined and constantly questioned and constantly reshaped and unshaped and opened up. So I think there should be another level. We can't just rely on the state idea of education, which goes through its, as it were, successive phases of fashion. In one set of 5 years, memorizing is more important than creativity. You know, if you have an inspired generation of leaders, creativity can become more important in education. But these fashions come and go and change, and we can't rely completely on that. I think another level of that has to come into being, and I think it's where poets, writers, thinkers, dreamers of all kinds can make their contribution.
Well, we're well over time, I'm sorry to say. So
You've been a wonderful audience.
If you want to have a chat with Ben, he will be signing books in the signing tent along there. This is the most inspirational book I've read all year, so please buy a copy and make sure that Ben can continue to write inspirational things. Join me in thanking him.
Thank you very much. The rain has stopped falling.